Story 1. My family used to live on the far edge of a city on the west coast. I was born in the city, but I do not live there anymore. The city is known for having a lot of problems like high crime rates and run-down areas. Before, I naively thought that if you dealt with one of the few landlords on the outskirts, it would be fine. However, things weren't as simple as I had imagined. The problem started about a month before the big finale. My stepfather was out of town to deal with a family issue, so it was just my mom, my two little sisters, and me at home. Our landlord, who I thought was normal, began showing up on the property a lot more often than usual. At first it seemed like he was just checking on things, but then he started coming by almost every day, sometimes late at night, which made us all feel uneasy. Nothing creepy happened at first, but he kept talking a lot about the bushes that grew on the side of the yard. He talked about what kind they were, when they would bloom, and how the flowers looked. This went on for about a week before he finally told us that he wanted to sell the land we were living on. He said we needed to start packing up and looking for a new place to live. Then, one night, everything got really weird. He showed up way before we were supposed to leave and started yelling at us, saying all the cars had to be moved from the side of the property by a certain date. Then he wandered off to an empty lot next to the house, took off his shirt, and started spinning around in circles. My family was really scared. We thought we were done dealing with the landlord for the day, so we started to relax. But then, out of nowhere, the landlord came back, driving up the driveway with a few tow trucks. Since my mom didn't have a driver's license, she couldn't move the cars like the landlord demanded. We ended up calling the sheriff for help while desperately trying to reach my dad on the phone, hoping he'd come home soon. The sheriff arrived and saw the landlord yelling at the tow truck drivers, demanding they take everything away and bill it to my dad. We explained to the sheriff that we had been given several days to move the vehicles, but the landlord showed up with the tow crew on the same night. The sheriff talked to the landlord, trying to calm him down. Eventually, the landlord stopped screaming at us, at least for a moment, but we were worried he might come back the next day to cause more trouble. Then, while we were cleaning up the house, the sheriff stopped my mom. His face was serious as he said, "I think he might try to come back and get into the house. If he does, just call us. I can't tell you to hurt him, but if he forces his way inside and you're scared for your family, you do what you have to." We got out before the landlord returned, which was a relief. We ended up staying with my uncle for a while until everything was ready at the new house. It was a bit stressful not having our own place for a bit, but we made it work. But whenever I go back to my old hometown, I can't shake the worry of bumping into our former landlord. Story 2. I'm not exactly sure what happened at the time, but somehow we lost our home even though later we bought that same house again. But for a few days we had to find a new place to live. We lived in a nice place outside of Lockhart, Texas. Following some searching, my parents found a trailer park. The trailer had 2 bedrooms. It was small for our family of 5, but we didn't have other options. The man who owned the trailer park was not a good person, but he's not the main character in this story. We lived in that trailer for a few months before we had to leave again. Not far from where we lived in the trailer park, there was a cul-de-sac of land. In the middle of these houses there was a place called the Why Not Party House. It was like a bar or a club, I guess. Since I was a kid, I never went inside. There were some houses and trailers spread out, and one of them was an old trailer that was available to rent. The man renting it, Mr. All was an old man. A couple of things about this trailer: it had old stone steps leading up to the front door, and the paint was peeling off the walls. It looked like it had been there for a long time, with a rusty mailbox out front and a porch with a few old steps. In one of the bedrooms there's a bunk bed, and there's also a kind of working air hockey table. The main bedroom had a big bed, like a queen-size one, and it's weird, but there's carpet in the kitchen. The back door was nailed shut and couldn't be opened at all, and if that wasn't bad enough, there were mice all over the place. My parents agreed to rent the trailer just by talking about it without any formal papers. Before we moved in, Mr. Dahl decided to make a new deck for us instead of the old steps. He even made a small picnic table for us to use outside. It was surprising to me as a kid that someone I didn't know could be so kind and take the time to make our home better. A mean person wouldn't do that kind of thing, would they? The first few weeks of rent from him went by without any problems. The main bedroom had no light bulbs, so my family and I all slept in the living room. But something about the bedroom with the bunk bed seemed scary to me. I'm not sure how my brothers felt, but they never slept in there either. Sometimes we were late with rent and had to pay extra fees, but apart from that, Mr. Dahl would understand everything, even if he got a bit annoyed sometimes. My mother's money came in on the 1st of every month, which was also when the bills were due. So she, my dad, and my older brother went into the city to pay the bills and get a money order for rent. I stayed home with my oldest brother. It was a time when we didn't have internet or cable, just VHS movies. Then, in the hallway, my oldest brother found out that the trailer was turned over. But something I want to tell you: all we didn't have any keys to this trailer, and the only person with a set of keys was Mr. Dahl, so we couldn't lock or unlock the trailer. While I was playing my game right by the locked door, I saw the knob turn. There was no knocking, the knob just moved, and our landlord tried to open the door twice, but he couldn't do it. He probably thought nobody was home because the car was gone, but the door was locked, so I thought it was okay to keep playing my game. That's what an 11-year-old thinks. Everything was silent for a while. Then my brother and I heard this noise outside our house. I thought it was a dog barking, but the longer we listened, we realized it was not an animal. Instead, it sounded like people yelling. My brother went to check out the noise at the front door, and because I was scared, I followed right behind him. Both of my parents were standing outside in the yard. My mother was yelling at the landlord, who was sitting on a big farming vehicle. My mom looked really mad, and her voice sounded really angry. My father was also shouting at him, but I can't remember exactly what they said. Later we found out when my parents came back to our trailer with the money order for rent, they saw Mr. all sitting on the farming vehicle, trying to block the main door of our house. My mom went into full protection mode because she knew her 2 children were stuck inside. She confronted him right away. Mr. Doll moved away from the door and quickly spun the vehicle around, coming dangerously close to my mom, almost hitting her with it. They didn't know what to do, so they called the police. When the police arrived and my parents told them what happened, it didn't help because we didn't have any legal agreement for renting the trailer. The officer just shrugged and said there wasn't anything they could do as nobody got hurt. We packed up as much as we could in our car and stored the belongings we took with us at my grandparents' house. Then we rented a motel room for the night. About a week later, we decided to go back for the rest of our belongings. We were worried about running into Mr. Doll, so we chose to go to the trailer at night. When we arrived, it was dark inside, and the porch light was off. My father and oldest brother went into the trailer. My mom and I were waiting in the car. In less than 5 minutes, my father and oldest brother ran out of the trailer faster than I had ever seen before. They looked really scared. They jumped into the car, and we sped away like in an action movie. My mom was terrified and kept asking what had happened, but they were too shaken to explain right away. When they calmed down a bit, they explained they went into the main bedroom first, which was on the right as soon as you walked in. They were planning to get a box of papers we had to leave behind, but then they saw something on the bed. It wasn't just someone sleeping, it was Mr. Doll, and next to him there was a big knife. We couldn't get back the rest of our furniture. My mom and I talk about it sometimes, but we're glad it's in the past. I can't help but wonder if all that abandoned furniture belonged to another unfortunate family who had to leave everything behind or had it even worse than us. Story 3. The apartment building where I lived with my family was old and had seen better days. It stood in the middle of a neglected neighborhood, with peeling paint and creaky floors. My parents chose it because it was cheap, and we didn't have many other options. The landlord, Mr. Hawkins, was a tall, thin man with a perpetual frown. He rarely spoke to us, except to collect the rent or give us vague warnings about the building's quirks. One night, after we'd been living there for a few months, strange things began to happen. It started with small, almost unnoticeable events: lights flickering, cold drafts in the middle of summer, and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. My parents brushed it off as the building's age, but my siblings and I were spooked. One evening, while I was doing my homework in the kitchen, I heard a loud thud from the living room. My little sister, who was playing with her dolls, screamed and ran to me, saying she saw a shadow moving on its own. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably just a trick of the light. But deep down I was scared too. The next day, my mom decided to talk to Mr. Hawkins about the strange occurrences. He listened to her concerns with a furrowed brow, then reluctantly admitted that the building had a history. He told us about a previous tenant who had died under mysterious circumstances. The official report said it was an accident, but rumors of foul play had persisted for years. Some believed the tenant's spirit still lingered in the building. That night, my mom did her best to reassure us, but we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the weeks went by, the strange events became more frequent and more intense. Doors would slam shut on their own, objects would move inexplicably, and the whispers grew louder. My dad, a skeptic by nature, tried to find logical explanations, but even he started to feel uneasy. One particularly terrifying night, we were all awakened by the sound of shattering glass. We rushed to the living room to find the window broken and a cold wind blowing in. My dad called the police, thinking it was a break-in, but they found no evidence of anyone entering or leaving the building. The officers left, scratching their heads, and we were left with more questions than answers. My mom, determined to protect her family, began researching ways to cleanse the apartment of any lingering spirits. She found an old book on spiritual rituals and decided to give it a try. We gathered in the living room, following the instructions from the book. We lit candles, burned sage, and recited incantations, hoping to banish whatever was haunting us. As we performed the ritual, the air grew thick with tension. The candles flickered wildly, and the whispers became deafening. Just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, everything suddenly stopped. The candles burned steadily, the whispers ceased, and a sense of calm settled over the apartment. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences gradually diminished. We still felt uneasy at times, but the overwhelming sense of dread had lifted. My parents decided it was time to move, and we found a new place on the other side of town. It wasn't perfect, but it was a fresh start. As we packed up our belongings, I couldn't help but wonder about the spirit that had haunted us. Had we really banished it, or had it simply chosen to leave us alone? The mystery of that old apartment building remained unsolved, but we were grateful to leave it behind. To this day, I still get chills thinking about our time there and the shadowy presence that lurked within those walls. Story 4. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, I went to a friend's party at their house in the UK. That year was really great for me. I didn't have any big worries, no work to do in the mornings, and my mom cooked dinner for me. I had nice clean bed sheets that I didn't have to clean or change. Then, life really got tough. But there's this one thing that really got to me. Once I went to that party I talked about earlier at my friend's place. She invited about 50 people. Most of them, like 90%, were from our school, but around 10% weren't. There were some older guys there. At first it felt weird because I didn't know them. Being 14 and a girl, I was cautious. Some of those guys seemed older than 16, maybe even 18. I mostly hung out with my school friends, the ones I knew and trusted. My main friend, who threw the party, was super busy talking to everyone and getting things sorted. Anyway, the evening was great, good food, good drinks, and awesome music. But then came the tricky part. I had to figure out how to get home because my mom didn't even know I was there. Obviously, I couldn't drive at 14. You might be wondering how my mom didn't know I was at the party. Well, she was on vacation and I was home alone. Well, except for my older brother, who just stayed glued to his computer all day. He didn't care if I was there or not, and it would probably take him 2 months to even realize I was gone. So, I was at the party, but I needed to get home. One of my friend's moms had given me a ride there. Then I thought it was only about 10 minutes away, so I'd just walk back once the party ended. My friend decided to end the party around 1 a.m. because her mom started getting upset. Even though her mom didn't really care about what anyone was doing, she said she needed to sleep because she had worked the next day. So, after all that, I left. I didn't ask for a ride from anyone because I didn't want to bother them, and hardly anyone there drove anyway. There were only 2 guys who drove, so they must have been at least 17, which made me think they were definitely older than us. I started walking home. It was dark, and some street lights were out. As I walked, I noticed car lights behind me. The car wasn't going at a normal speed like the others that had passed me. It was going really slow. Finally, the car stopped completely, and the guy rolled down the window. I recognized him from the party. He asked if I needed a ride, but I got the creepiest feeling from him. I decided to say no and keep walking, but he was persistent. He drove alongside me at my walking speed with the window still down. He kept saying things like, "You shouldn't be out here at this time of night. It's too late. Come on, it's getting cold. Let me give you a ride back." The more he insisted, the more suspicious he seemed to me. It raised more and more red flags, and I was just about ready to run. He suddenly stopped the car. This totally caught me off guard because he'd been driving alongside me for the past 5 minutes, urging me to get in the car. I turned to face him, not sure what to do. I knew I couldn't run from him. He was much bigger and faster than me, and I was wearing shoes with about 3-inch heels, so I wouldn't stand a chance. I realized that if something bad was going to happen, the only thing I could do was scream for help. So that's what I did. I just screamed as loud as I could, like I'd gone completely crazy. Eventually, almost everyone on the street heard me, and several neighbors opened their windows. The guy just stood there, his car still running. I think he noticed that everyone was watching. He looked up at all the windows with people and lights on. 2 of them had their windows open and were just looking out. They didn't say anything. I think they were just curious. Once he saw them, he turned around, got back in his car, and quickly drove away. Some of my friends say he's a nice guy, but he didn't go to our school. He actually went to college, but I didn't know him and didn't want to get in his car no matter what. Story 5. In 2012, during the winter, I found myself staying late at the library. The sun had already set, leaving the surroundings dark. It was evening, and the usual buzz of my friends studying alongside me was absent. I couldn't recall the reason why they didn't come. As I gathered my belongings, the library announced it was closing in 5 minutes. I was totally focused on studying because I had a test in just 3 days. I gathered my books and packed them into my backpack. Then I slung it over my shoulder and headed towards the library exit. It was so quiet that it felt like the silence was loud. Libraries are always quiet, but it felt like I was the only one there besides the lady who worked there. When I stepped outside, I felt how freezing it was. The temperature had dropped a lot, and when I looked around, there wasn't anyone else on the campus at all. I walked all the way back to where I lived, but before I reached home, something really scary happened. About halfway there, I had to cross a big road. The campus is divided into two parts, which is kind of weird. I don't know why they designed it like that, but there's a highway running through the campus. Crossing it during the day was no big deal, but at night it was definitely more challenging. There's this big flight of steps that goes over the highway. Some people call it a flyover. It's like a bridge where you walk on top to cross over. It's pretty cool. When I visited Europe and the UK, I saw a lot more of them there. They're quite common in those places, but not so much where I live, or at least not in the state I'm from. I reached the steps and started climbing, making sure to watch my step. It was only the beginning of winter, right after fall, so there wasn't much snow yet, but it was really cold with frosty temperatures. I was bundled up in warm clothes, wearing a beanie hat and a scarf, but I was still freezing. The worst part was my nose. It felt so numb and tingly. I climbed up the first set of steps, and now I had to walk across the highway on the platform. So, that's what I did. As I reached halfway across, I noticed a few cars passing by. The traffic had quieted down by then, I guess because rush hour was over. Most folks had already made it home from work, maybe around 7. There were a few cars passing by, but nothing unusual. That is, until I reached the end of the platform. I was about to go down the second set of steps to get back on the other side of the highway when I saw something really weird. The speed limit on the highway was like 80, maybe even faster. I'm not a driver, so don't quote me on that, but all the cars were going fast. Then there was this one van. It looked like the kind of van you'd imagine some creepy person driving, trying to snatch people up. I couldn't believe it. They weren't driving at the speed limit or even close to it. They were going really slow, like a snail's pace. I thought maybe they were lost, but how do you get lost on a highway? I was getting closer to them because they were going so slow. It seemed like their van might stop right where the stairs met the ground. As I went down the stairs, I was really nervous, trying to be quiet and still avoiding their eyes. But now I was even more scared and unsure about what was happening with the people in that van. I was about halfway down the stairs when I noticed the van had stopped right at the bottom step. Getting closer, I could see 2 men sitting inside, completely concealing their faces in the darkness. I could see their mouths and tell they were guys by their jawlines. I slowed down, pretending to be cautious of the ice while I thought about what to do next. Something felt off, so I didn't want to go all the way down the stairs. If their van had broken down, they'd get out and put their hazard lights on, but they weren't doing any of that. They just sat there. As I got closer, they were watching me, following my every move. That was it. I turned around and started running back up the steps toward my campus. But somehow I slipped on the ice and tumbled down, landing hard on my forearms. I used them to catch myself, and it hurt a lot. The concrete steps felt like they broke my bones. I got up, but my arms felt really sore, like they were shattered. But I didn't care about that right then. I started sprinting back across the platform. I thought I heard the van door open and close, and it made me run even faster. I was breathing hard, panicking more with each step. When I reached the other staircase to go back down, I didn't even think about the ice. I just kept running, skipping steps, and almost fell again, but I made it down to the first step without slipping. I didn't dare to look back as I was too scared of them. In my head, I felt like they were right behind me, like they were chasing me. I made it back to the university campus and dashed into the library. Luckily, the worker hadn't left yet. She looked surprised to see me in such a panic. I told her everything that happened, and she suggested we call campus security. After a while, campus security arrived and offered to drive me home. They also checked the area for the van, but they couldn't find anything. They said they'd look into it more, but I never heard back from them about what they found. It was the scariest thing that ever happened to me, and to this day I still get anxious walking alone at night. Story 6. I lived in Spain for a while when I was younger. There was an old, ruined building at the edge of the town. It was always shrouded in mystery and had many stories about it. Locals said it was haunted, but my friends and I were skeptical. We decided to check it out one weekend. We went to the building during the day, as it was less scary. The place was as creepy as it looked from the outside. The floors creaked, the walls were covered in graffiti, and there were broken windows everywhere. We explored every corner, laughing at our fears and trying to spook each other. As we were about to leave, I found an old, dusty book in one of the rooms. It looked ancient and fragile. Curiosity got the best of me, so I opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings. My friends gathered around, equally intrigued and freaked out. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise from upstairs. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. One of my friends suggested it was just the wind, but we were all too scared to check. We decided to leave the book and get out of there as fast as we could. We ran out of the building and didn't stop until we were back in the town center. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the book and the noise. I felt like something was watching me, and I had trouble sleeping. The next day, my friends and I agreed not to go back to the building again. We never found out what caused the noise, and the memory of that day still gives me chills. Story 6. I work as a security officer for a company in Southern California. We team up with the sheriff's department to keep the areas we serve safe. My role as a patrol officer is quite similar to that of a police officer. Unlike typical security guards who simply observe and report, we're trained to respond to a variety of situations, from dealing with trespassers and burglaries to handling domestic disputes. I've chased after people on foot and in vehicles a few times. It's just how we do things. Now that you understand our job, let me share with you an experience I will never forget. Usually I worked the late shift, but because of low manpower I had to switch to the day shift. I remember driving around the city in my patrol car, listening to our radio for calls. Then one came in from my district, a burglary alarm on the north side of the city, out in the desert. It must have been around 1 in the morning when I was sent to check it out. As soon as I turned onto the street for the property, I went dark, which means I turned off all the lights. The building used to be where they packed onions with big hangars on the west side, but now it's empty and we're hired to keep an eye on it. I've gone inside many times during my nightly checks, but nothing unusual ever occurred until this particular night. Also, keep in mind there are no working lights on the property, so everything inside was dark. Anyway, I drove to the west side of the property, checking the outside carefully. That's when I noticed a door that was slightly open. I radioed in. "This is Lincoln 1. I found a door open on the west side of the hangars. Can you send another unit to my location?" I was standing next to my car, having a smoke in the rare drizzle that Southern California gets. I actually enjoy the rain. The wind's pretty strong tonight too, if I recall correctly. After about 5 minutes, my buddy and partner shows up. He's actually a really close friend of mine outside of work. We grab our flashlights and head inside. The first thing that hits you when you walk in is the strong smell of onions. I mean, it's so strong that you can practically taste it in your nose. The hangars we're checking are big, dark, and empty, with that stinky smell everywhere. This is where things start to get disturbing. We can hear the light rain tapping on the metal roof, the wind finding its way through any openings it can. Then it happens, we hear footsteps on the roof of the hangars. I glance at my partner and say, "These hangars don't have a way up to the roof." "Then how did they get there?" He shrugs and says, "Dude, I also have no idea." Lincoln 1 to control. Just to let you know, we're hearing footsteps on the roof. We're on the scene investigating. We'll update you soon. Dispatch confirms, and we start searching through the building, checking every corner. Then we step outside and check around the building. Just as I suspected, no way up to the roof. Why would anyone be up there in this weather anyway? We blame it on the wind. We check everything we can and call it Code 4, meaning all good. As we're walking back through the hangars we just checked, which is the only way out to get back to our vehicles, something really creepy happens. Now, I've never believed in ghosts or anything like that, and I always thought those ghost shows on TV were silly. They always talk about hearing whispers on those shows, but never understanding what's being said. Well, believe it or not, my partner and I heard whispering, like multiple voices all at once. It was crystal clear, but I couldn't make out a single word. My partner and I stood dead in our tracks and just looked at each other, frozen in place. I called in a Code 6 again, and we started searching the property once more. We knew what we heard wasn't normal, but we had to check if someone was possibly still inside that we missed. That's when everything went crazy. Doors started slamming shut all over the place. My partner and I just looked at each other without saying a word. We walked outside. I can't say we were scared, but we were definitely surprised. I reported a secondary code 4. I'm outside with my partner and I glance at him. Let's just say it was the wind, I said. That was the last time I ever went to that place before I got promoted to corporal and switched to day shifts. I still don't believe in most ghost stories, but I can tell you for sure it wasn't just the wind that night. Story 6. When I was 12 years old, I lived in a small town in Washington. I think it was summertime, and I was excited to spend time with my best friend, Rose. I asked my grandma if I could stay over at Rose's house, and she nodded yes. When I arrived at Rose's place, one of our classmates, a boy whose name I can't quite recall now, also came to her house. He had this new game he was excited for us to try out. He lived 2 houses down from her. We arrived at his house around 6:30, but honestly the game he brought wasn't very fun, so I ended up just staring out of his bedroom window. It was really dark outside, and all I could see were our reflections in the window and the glow from the TV. I was sitting right next to the window, and if I leaned a bit I could see up into the tree branches. So I glanced up and saw 2 red eyes looking back at me. I got really scared and tried to see what was there, but it was too dark to make out anything else. All I could see were those red eyes. I felt my throat tighten, and I started shaking. I turned to my friends by the TV and whispered, "Guys, look up at the tree. Can you see what I see?" Rose looked at me, then at the tree, and she froze, looking really scared. Our other friend looked too, but then he ran out of the room. We both chased after him because we definitely didn't want to stay alone. He found his dad sitting in the living room watching TV. At first his dad didn't believe us, but eventually he got up and looked outside. He saw the eyes too, just staring at us like they could see right into our hearts. Our friend's dad grabbed his baseball bat and told us to stay inside. He hurried out the back door and closed it tight behind him. But soon after, we heard our friend's dad yelling at whatever was in the backyard. And then he rushed back inside, almost breaking the door in his haste. He gathered us all into the master bedroom, which was the only door that locked besides the main and back doors. Soon enough, the police arrived, but when we told them what happened, they didn't believe us. They just said we were imagining things. But we knew deep down that it wasn't just our imagination. How could 4 of us, including an adult, all see the same thing? Story 1. This was a horrifying experience that I can't explain. I love your videos, so I figured I'd send in one of my weirder experiences. I'm a skeptic, so this one has confused me for many years, even though I'm the one who experienced it. When I was in middle school, about 10 years old, my friend had come over to hang out like he did most Saturdays. He was one of my best friends, and both of us were pretty observant of our surroundings, so whenever something weird came up, we would point it out to each other pretty quickly. At the time, my sister had this small, realistic baby doll that could walk on all 4s on its own if it had batteries. I never personally took much note of it, other than the fact I thought it was neat it could blink if you tilted it the right way. One day, when we entered the playroom of my house, we found the doll centered in the room. Again, at the time, we didn't think much of it since I had seen it many times with no issue. I did have a glancing thought that it was weird it had been taken out when my sister hadn't played with it in years. Otherwise, I just threw it hard against the wall so that it would bank off into the nearby toy crate we had. My friend, who we will call Jay, tended to like to switch between playing outside and inside the house, so we went outside for a bit. Everything was fine and normal until we came back into the house. Jay stood stunned for a number of seconds when we entered the hallway leading to the playroom. I quickly followed his eyes to see the electronic doll crawling down the hallway in a straight line towards us. It was made to do this as the toy's main function, but because of its age and rough play, it sort of hobbled back and forth while approaching from the end of the hall. I looked at him, and we both had the same immediate thought that it was my sister. This had to be the case because it wouldn't have been able to move using the old acid-leaking AA batteries it had inside. We both walked forward and grabbed the doll, causing it to make the squeeze-activated crying sound it makes. We called out for my sister but received no response. Confused, we looked all around the house for her. It turned out she was still asleep and had been nowhere near the doll all day. I would like to note that my family is not the kind to prank each other, especially not with freaky things like dolls. With this, Jay and I started to get a little freaked out. So, we put the doll carefully under a bunch of toys in the playroom and left it. We didn't have any issues for the next few weeks of playing. One weekend, however, he and I were sitting at my family's dining room table. He was sitting across from me. Behind me was our living room, which had some couches and 2 giant bookshelves. As I was talking with him and drinking a soda while he was taking a sip of his soda, he suddenly spit the soda all over the table. This was obviously surprising for me, especially because he was pretty calm in demeanor usually. I asked him what happened, and he just silently pointed behind me. I turned to look around and froze when I saw that doll sitting on top of one of the giant bookshelves a good distance behind me, facing us. We both sprinted to my mother, who was outside at the time, and asked her if she'd put it up there. Note that neither my friend nor I could have ever reached the top where the doll was, as the bookshelves were almost twice our full height. We both were horrified when she asked us what doll we were talking about. Now, seeing as none of my family would prank us and my father was not home ever, and my friend and I did not pull pranks on each other, we both started freaking out. There was something not right about this doll. We asked my mother to get it for us, after which we took it to our garbage cans way outside the front of the house on my family's farming property. For a number of weeks, that was the end of it. We started to forget about it until one morning. I woke up on a weekend without my friend being over. I had idly considered a couple of times if it had been Jay who put the doll in those spots, but this morning proved that theory false. I walked into the kitchen, which had a glass door to the front porch connected to it. I couldn't move when I saw it. Outside, stuck halfway down the walkway leading to the glass doors, was the doll positioned as though it had been crawling towards the door with its face against the ground. I told my mother about everything Jay and I had experienced. She is a religious woman who isn't really scared of much, but dolls are something she isn't super comfortable with for some unspoken reason. She immediately went outside, took the doll, and said she'd take care of it. I asked her later what she did with it, and she said she waited for it to dry since it had been rained on and soaked through to its mostly fabric center and burned it, tossing the plastic and electronic remains in the bin. We never had any more experiences with the doll, but I still wonder to this day what could have possibly done that if not for any of my family members, which circumstantially wouldn't have made sense at the time. Again, I am a skeptic, but that one stumps me to this day. If you enjoy tales of the paranormal, the strange, and the unexplained, then I'd love it if you could become a part of our growing community. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future episodes. I'm working on a big haunted house story for the next one, so I'd hate for you to miss out on it. Also, if you want to support the channel, you can do that really easily just by clicking like. Story 2. I started working a new job that my best friend helped me get. He didn't tell me anything beforehand. We worked the overnight shift 3 days a week. We'd get deliveries and had about 6 people working. On the other days it was just 3 of us, sometimes 1 during slow periods. The store had 16 aisles, with 14 to 16 being at the very back. My first day was a truck day, and I was assigned to aisles 8 and 9 to work, being that I was new and those were easier. There was someone working in 10 right next to me. While I was working, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a black shadow or mass pass by really fast. I thought it was odd since the direction it headed was a dead end, with nothing there. I thought it was the other worker because he was wearing all black. After I finished what I was doing, I went to aisle 10 and saw him sitting on the floor working the bottom shelves. I asked if he had passed by a few minutes earlier, and he said no. I walked to aisle 2, where my friend had been working. I told him what I'd seen, and he said he'd seen shadows too, but didn't want to tell me, wanting me to experience it for myself and then come to him. He told me he'd frequently see the shadow out of the corner of his eye. He'd turn to look, and it was gone. Fast forward a couple of months. Some new people started working there, and they too would see the shadows moving and would come to us and tell us. We'd tell them nothing beforehand so as not to put things in their minds. One time it was me and another worker my friend was off at about 6 a.m. We were done with our duties and went to the front of the store to get ready to open and get relieved by the morning shift. We were discussing the strange things we'd both experienced, the shadow figures, the footsteps, and weird noises when all of a sudden we heard a loud slap of a plastic bag and a loaf of bread flew to the floor. It had been on the top shelf, about 6 feet high, on a metal rack. There were no customers in the store yet, and we were about 10 feet away from where the loaf had been. Nothing was moving on the rack, and the bag that was under the loaf wasn't moving either. We looked at each other and confirmed with a yes that we had both seen the bread just fly off the shelf. From that point on, we would see the shadow figures, but nothing like that ever happened again. We did try to go back there with a new person later to try and make them a believer, but it didn't work. Nothing happened. Story 3. I recently experienced something paranormal during my night shift at a school. It was my second month working there. We only had 3 security guards at night. 2 of us would patrol the school while the other monitored the cameras. It was my partner's turn to watch the cameras, and I went out to patrol. I started at the front entrance and made my way through the hallways. It was dark and I was only using a flashlight. As I passed by the music room, I heard what sounded like a piano key being pressed. I stopped and shone my flashlight into the room, but I didn't see anything. I continued walking but heard the piano key again. I turned back, entered the room, and looked around. There was nothing out of place. I thought maybe it was an old piano making noise, so I left the room and continued my patrol. As I was heading towards the gym, I heard the sound again, but this time it was louder. I turned around and saw a shadow figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was just standing there, not moving. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly turned back to the gym. I entered the gym, hoping to shake off the feeling of being watched. I did my usual checks and found everything in order. When I left the gym, the shadow figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence. I quickly made my way back to the security room and told my partner what had happened. He didn't seem surprised and told me that he had experienced similar things during his patrols. He said the school was known to be haunted, but he didn't want to scare me since I was new. Since that night, I've seen the shadow figure a few more times and heard the piano key sound on several occasions. It doesn't seem to be harmful, but it definitely makes my night shifts more unsettling. Story 4. I lived in a house on a farm for about 8 years. It was a small, 2-story house that had been built in the early 1900s. It was a great place to live, but there was always something odd about it. The first thing I noticed was the footsteps. They were always upstairs when no one was up there. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but the footsteps were too distinct and deliberate. They would start at one end of the hallway and go to the other end. Sometimes they would stop right at the top of the stairs. One night I was watching TV in the living room when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder and faster. It sounded like someone was running down the hallway. I got up and went to the bottom of the stairs to see if I could see anything. The footsteps stopped, and I didn't see anyone. I went upstairs to check, but there was no one there. Another time, I was in the kitchen cooking dinner when I heard a loud bang upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I ran upstairs to see what had happened, but I couldn't find anything out of place. The noise had come from one of the bedrooms, but there was nothing in there that could have made that sound. One of the strangest things that happened was when I was in bed one night. I had just turned off the light and was about to go to sleep when I felt something sit on the edge of the bed. I could feel the mattress sink down and I heard the springs creak. I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. I got up and looked around the room, but I didn't see anything unusual. Over the years, I got used to the strange occurrences. They didn't happen all the time, but when they did, they were always unsettling. I never felt threatened, but I always felt like I was being watched. When I moved out of the house, I asked the new owners if they had experienced anything strange. They said they had heard the footsteps and had seen shadows moving around the house. It was comforting to know that I wasn't the only one who had experienced these things, but it also confirmed that there was something paranormal going on in that house. Story 5. I used to work as a security guard at an old hospital that had been converted into office buildings. The hospital had a long history and was rumored to be haunted. I had heard stories from other guards about strange things happening, but I didn't believe them until I experienced it myself. One night I was doing my rounds when I heard a woman crying. It sounded like it was coming from one of the old patient rooms. I followed the sound and found myself in a hallway that hadn't been used in years. The crying was getting louder, but I couldn't find the source. I checked all the rooms, but they were all empty. The sound was so clear that it felt like it was right next to me. Suddenly, the crying stopped and there was complete silence. I quickly left the hallway and went back to my post. Another night I was watching the security cameras when I saw a figure in one of the hallways. It looked like a woman in a hospital gown. She was just standing there, not moving. I switched to a different camera to get a better look, but she was gone. I rewound the footage, but there was no sign of her. It was like she had just disappeared. One of the creepiest things that happened was when I was in the basement. The basement was used for storage and was always dark and damp. I was checking the locks on the storage rooms when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. I could feel a cold breeze on the back of my neck, and I got the feeling that someone was standing right behind me. I ran up the stairs and didn't go back to the basement for the rest of my shift. After that, I started to believe the stories I had heard. The old hospital was definitely haunted. I was glad when I got transferred to a different building. I still think about the things I saw and heard, and I wonder if the spirits of the old hospital are still there, haunting the halls and rooms where they once lived and died. Story 6. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The cabin was old and rustic, but it had a certain charm to it. We were looking forward to a weekend of hiking, fishing, and just relaxing in nature. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, played some board games, and then went to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like someone was walking around outside the cabin. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything. I figured it was just an animal and went back to sleep. The next day we went hiking and explored the area around the cabin. We found an old cemetery a few miles away. The graves were old and overgrown, and it looked like no one had visited them in years. There was something eerie about the place, and we didn't stay long. That night we built a fire and sat around telling stories. As it got later, we decided to go inside and get some sleep. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard the noise again. This time it was louder and closer. It sounded like footsteps on the porch. I got up and went to the window. I saw a shadow move across the porch, but I couldn't make out what it was. I woke up my friends, and we all went to check it out. There was nothing there, but we all felt uneasy. The next morning we found strange marks on the porch. They looked like claw marks, but they were too big to be from any animal we knew of. We decided to cut our trip short and leave that day. As we were packing up, one of my friends found an old journal in a drawer. It was from the previous owner of the cabin. The entries talked about strange noises and sightings around the cabin. The owner believed the cabin was haunted by the spirits of the people buried in the old cemetery. We left the cabin as quickly as we could. I still think about that weekend and wonder what it was that we heard and saw. I'm not sure if it was the spirits of the old cemetery or something else, but it was definitely one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had.